revolution.
Are we on the air?
Yes, you are.
Live from the studios in Barcelona, Spain.
Please welcome.
It's Slade Suter Live on Authenticity Radio.
Thank you very much.
Where the honesty is refreshing, phoniness out of style, and the only thing available on today's menu is the freedom to express who you truly are.
That is what they do.
This is Authenticity Radio.
And thank you so much for joining us on the morning edition on Authenticity Radio. This is Slade Suter. We are back with the Food and Water Watch. And why are we back on watch? Well, because we have much, much more to talk about. And today, we are gifted with the presence of patty-lovera. Patty is the Food Programs Director, and we will be asking her about our nation's food supply and the safety concerns that we all have that seems to be grabbing the headlines. And so, patty-lovera, welcome to the morning edition on Authenticity Radio.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking time to be with us today. Patty, what are the main concerns for our nation's food supply?
So there's kind of a couple different categories. When you talk to somebody probably in the food industry and definitely in the government, and you say the words food safety, they are often talking about a pretty narrow set of issues, and food safety has kind of been defined to mean things like bacteria or other pathogens that may make us sick, things like E. coli or salmonella or listeria. And that's important, and we have regulations on a lot of those things. Some of them need to be updated or enforced better, but that's historically what food safety has meant to the government. But there's a whole other set of issues that we're behind on figuring out. Things like, residues of chemicals that might be left in food from the way that we raise them, whether it's pesticides or herbicides or, contaminants because of something that's happening in the production system. And then also we have a whole host of new technologies, really, that we weren't dealing with 30 or 40 years ago. So, genetically engineered crops, or GMOs, is one good example of that. And a lot of times we're using old regulations and old rules to try to deal with these new technologies. And so I think when you talk to an average person just thinking about health and how they interact with the food supply, they would call those questions food safety questions too, but sometimes our regulators aren't, and that we have a little bit of a disconnect there that we're still working on.
Okay, so the FDA has a much bigger plate these days.
Yeah, and they have a lot to do, so they have to worry about, is there dangerous, pathogens that might make us sick, like salmonella in produce, or, we've just had a big recall, recently with, listeria in ice cream, which is not something that we thought about as a risky food, right? So they have a lot to do there. They are in the process of updating some regulations at FDA, which are long overdue, but it's a hard process to do in a workable manner, and they're still figuring that out. Right. But we're always on FDA, to look at this other stuff too. We think they're behind when it comes to things like residues.
So we're looking at immediate health concerns like salmonella and these issues, and then we have a larger picture health concerns, which are the concerns of pesticides and herbicides within the food supply, antibiotics, for example, as well. Filtrating through our products. And then you mentioned genetically modified organisms. What is that? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So there's a lot of debate about this, but there's also a lot of confusion about what GMOs are. So, technically, folks in the government, folks in the food industry, we usually call them genetically engineered crops. A lot of the rest of the world calls them GMOs, for genetically modified organisms. You'll probably hear me switch back and forth between the two, actually. So this is not what we have always done in agriculture, what you learned about in high school biology class, where you're, with the experiments with the peas, and you're selecting like this, Mendel and his peas and how he improved crops, and you're just kind of constantly crossing, different varieties of the same plant together to improve them. That's not what we're talking about. Genetic engineering is in the laboratory doing something to alter the genetic material of that plant in a way that wouldn't happen with traditional breeding, just crossing two plants together. So it's things like adding genetic material from a different species into something. So, some of the earliest GMOs were things like fish genes in a plant, in a tomato. Often it's bacterial genetic material they're using to insert somebody else's genetic material into a plant to make it do something specific. There's newer technologies.
How tasty is that, a fishy tomato?
And that was one of the first generations. The newer generations, they're literally talking about gene editing, where they go in and turn a gene on or off. And the question is, how much precision do they really have? What other changes might you be making in there? And to date, the U.S. is one of the biggest adopters in the world of these crops. So the vast majority of our corn, our soybeans, cotton, real big the big players in our agriculture system are largely GMOs at this point. And the main reason they've been engineered is to either incorporate the plant itself with pesticides, so the tissues of the plants are now incorporating an insecticide so bugs won't eat it, or to allow that plant to be sprayed with an herbicide. The first generation of these crops were engineered to be sprayed with Roundup. And so the crops would live when they get sprayed with Roundup, and the weeds are supposed to die. Often those traits are bundled together, and the same plant might have both those alterations.
Jiminy Christmas, how scary.
So that's the question. Is this a good idea in terms of what happens to the food itself? Do we understand enough about what changed in that food? And also, this is a different production system. This is a production system that's really ramping up the use of chemicals, like Roundup. We've seen a dramatic increase in the use of that particular herbicide because it's packaged to be used with crops, and it's sold as a package deal. And so we need to be asking public health questions and environmental questions about what do we know when we use that much more of these chemicals. And we are not confident that our regulatory system is asking those right questions. It's too easy to get this stuff on the market, and it's really kind of taken over American agriculture.
And Patty, do you have a current percentage of how much, for example, corn is now genetically modified in the States?
We're usually right around the low 90s in terms of percentage. So I think the last one I've seen was like 92 or 93%.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're talking the vast majority.
Wow. Last I heard it was like around 70%. So there's been a big increase these last years of genetically, and soybeans as well? It's
right around the same area. I think it's the high 80s. So it's really very, very dominant.
Okay.
Technology at this point. And there's a lot of, in addition to the health questions, there's a lot of, this has changed the structure of the seed industry, and it's really led to a lot of consolidation. And so it's harder for farmers to buy something that's not a GMO. And it's raised their prices.
So there's several states in trying to make a mandatory ban or labeling. Is that correct?
Right. So there's been a couple states that have done this and a couple states that have not. So one of the many criticisms we have is that these crops were put on the market with no requirement that there's be disclosure about where they are, no requirement that the foods they end up in be labeled. And that was one of many mistakes made, in the 90s when these crops first started making their way onto the scene. So in the last couple of years, there's been a really vibrant movement at the local level, at the state level, to say, all right, we need to at least get labels on these foods so people know where they are. So people have gone to the ballot, for like a referendum or an initiative in California, Colorado, Oregon, and they've come really close. In Oregon, the most recent one in Oregon, last fall failed by 800 votes.
Oh, dear.
In the whole state. So, and it's usually a mismatch in money. The industry, food processing companies, the big biotech companies like Monsanto, they're spending millions of dollars to try to block these initiatives. The folks who want labeling are always outspent, and they're still coming that close. What has happened that's interesting, though, in the last couple of years is when people go to their state legislature, to their elected officials who are in the state legislature, in Maine, Connecticut, and Vermont, they have passed laws that have been signed saying those states are going to require labeling. The issue now is that Maine and Connecticut put like a waiting period on there. They're waiting for other states to join them before their law kicks in. Vermont didn't have that waiting period, but the industry is suing the state of Vermont to try to make that law not go into effect, and we're in the middle of that court process right now.
They're suing. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
They're that opposed to people knowing how their food is produced. that and in addition to that, they're now in Congress in D.C. saying that Congress should tell the states you don't have the right to require this labeling because they're terrified of this statewide movement. Folks at the local level getting these bills passed and getting this labeling, and so they've come to D.C. to try to put a stop to that.
So our listeners are empowered, and their power is their voice.
Right. I mean, we have to. So we're told a lot that our only job, in this economy or in this food system, we're told that our only job is to shop, right? And the only thing we can do is to shop better or vote with your dollar. We hear that a lot, and we can do some things with that. And I'm not discounting that, but we also have to change the rules, right? And so we have to act as citizens and members of our bigger society, not just as consumers and shoppers. And so this is a great example of that. So in different issues and at different points in history, there's going to be different moments where maybe Congress can do this piece or maybe the states can do this piece. Right now, wherever you live in the U.S., we need to be telling your member of Congress, do not block states from changing these laws. We're making this happen at the state level. Leave it alone. Depending on what state you live in, in the next couple months or going into next year, there may be a bill that you could say, I support this bill and I'm going to require labeling here where I live. So there's absolutely things we have to do as voters and as citizens, not just as shoppers.
Okay. Are there any hot tickets up right now? Are there any states up to vote for GMO labeling?
So right now we're entering the point in the year, so state legislatures tend to work from January till about now, and then they go home for the rest of the year. So we're kind of ending that season. But New York State, so in Albany, and the New York legislature, they're still in, and they are still talking about a GMO labeling bill in New York, and that would be huge because it's such a big population, and it would help those other states, Connecticut and Maine, get their bills into effect too. So that's one we're really involved in right now. Okay,
New York State listeners, you have a job to do. And provided you want to, there's no force here. However, if you're listening to this program, you may want to contact your legislator and to add your voice. Is there a form or something that they can jump onto? Is there a connection through your website?
Yes, if you go to, actually probably the easiest thing to do is go to our website, which is foodandwaterwatch.org, and we have an action page, and that'll take you to various things, and also we have a lot of this stuff on our Facebook page too.
Patty, what is your bottom line message that you would like to deliver to humanity?
Okay. I think it's similar to what we just talked about. I think that our job, as members of a community is not just to consume things, but to get involved and really be involved in determining what the rules of the game are so that they can be fair. And then, this applies to the food system and lots of other things that we have work to do, as members of the community to make sure that we have a level playing field for everybody and that good, environment and food and all these other systems will come out of that we can't just sit back and expect somebody else to do it.
Wow, Patty. And is there anything else you would like to say to our listeners in regards to our nation's food supply?
Yeah, one thing to tell people too is that, while I was talking about those big percentages, organic farmers cannot use GMO seeds. So that's a really good option, and you get a lot of other benefits too from organic. They're not using, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and things like that.
That was a very, very big question, at least here in Spain. It is that the organic labeling does ensure that it also includes GMO.
Right. Yeah, and organic is bigger than that. And so we're seeing a lot of non-GMO labeling, and it tells you that one thing, and that's a useful thing, right? Non-GMO is good to know, but organic tells you more than that. There's a whole other set of practices that are really geared towards the environment and minimizing chemical inputs and lots of things like that. And organic tells you that they're not using GMOs and they're doing this whole other set of practices.
Okay, the power of the consumer. Go ahead, and when you're out, look for your organic labeling and support them. And also be more active as well. Contact your legislator because your voice does count. So, Patty, thank you so much for your time today.
All right, thank you.
This is Slade Suter. Be authentic, be true, and be free. Mama, take me home, country road.
Real real people and real authentic talk. This is Authenticity Radio.